if we're going to invite people into this kind of gospel practice in their life, that there is actually healing to be found in presenting the truth of our sin before the Lord. If we're going to really meaningfully invite people into that, I think we have to be people who know that way ourselves and know what it is to live by grace in our own lives, not just commending a gospel to them that we don't know experientially.
Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology and Raw. My guest today is Dr. Jamin Goggin, who has a PhD from the best university in the world, that is University of Aberdeen. And he is associate professor at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University and the director of the Healthy Pastor Initiative at Finishing the Task. He is the co-author of The Way of the Dragon or The Way of the Lamb, an outstanding book, and the author of his recently released book, Pastoral Confessions, The Healthy Path to Faithful Ministry. I got my copy right here for those of you watching on YouTube. Really enjoyed this conversation with Jamin. He's incredibly brilliant, has tons of pastoral experience. Most of all, I just found him to be incredibly down to earth and humble. Really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Dr. Jamin Goggin. Jamin, good to have you on Theology in the Raw. Thanks for taking time to do this. Really excited to talk to you.
Joy to be with you.
So you were a pastor for how many years before you became a professor?
Yeah, 20 years, full-time local church ministry pastor, and kind of every role imaginable and almost every ecclesial environment imaginable, at least in the U.S. I was a youth pastor at a small non-denom church. I was kind of associate pastor who oversaw youth and family and various things at a Lutheran church.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I worked at Saddleback Church, mega church here in SoCal, as a spiritual formation pastor, running retreats and doing spiritual retreats for folks for several years. And then I was a lead pastor of a church in San Diego. So kind of runs the gamut over the course of 20 years.
What was it like being at Saddleback? I mean, that is 30,000 people or something. I mean, one of the biggest churches in America, at least.
Yeah.
What was that like? What's the culture
like? Yeah. It's been several years for me since I worked there. It's been a decade, but yeah, my story with Saddleback, I think, is a fairly unique one in that I was born and raised there. Okay. And my parents really are charter members of the church. So I had a experience growing up in the life of that church. So I think it's fairly unique, maybe in a mega church environment. I knew all the pastors. I was friends with the pastors' children. I was in the pastors' homes, Rick Warren in particular, but really all the kind of found the group of earliest kind of executive pastors and leaders in the church. I had personal relationships with them. So when the church started to really explode and grow, and in large measure in connection with the release of kind of Rick's two books, that kind of purpose-driven church and then purpose-driven life, right? Like you could kind of mark those moments as moments of real significant growth in the life of the church in some ways. Obviously, it was kind of slow, rapid growth over a long course of time actually there, but those were two real inflection points. By the time the church kind of exploded in size in those years, my teenage years, it still always felt like a small church, a community church. I was one of the brats in the green room. You know, I was the kid that on Sunday did youth group and then went up to big church and maybe went back to another youth group service. I was just church all Sunday morning, and I loved it. And people I knew everywhere. And so for me, there was a real, a rich relational experience there. I was really invested in, cared for well. And so at any rate, when I went off to college, went to seminary, worked at other churches for several years. It was quite a while until I actually worked at Saddleback. It wasn't until, maybe over a decade after I had graduated, I came back from high school. Okay. I came back to Saddleback to work. And at that point, in many ways, it was a very different church, a lot of new folks on staff. But for me, it was a coming home and a really sweet time to reinvest in the church that had been so meaningful in my own formation, where I had come to learn the gospel, where I'd been baptized. And my parents were still members there at the time. It's where I met my wife in high school, right? So there was this real sweetness actually about coming back to serve and to bless my home church
Hmm.
for about 5 years before I
Okay.
transitioned on. Yeah.
So I'm fighting back a sneeze right now. If I do, I'll try not to blow your ears off in the microphone. Okay. But
You're
if you
okay.
see me,
You gave me fair warning, so I'll brace myself.
all right, here we go. So, mega churches. I would say, people have mixed reviews, right? I mean, some people think they're
Mm.
the greatest thing in the world. Other people think they're of the devil. I'm sure you've had pros and cons. Like, what's your when people ask you, what's your thought on mega churches? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I guess I feel um, my primary response tends to be hopefully marked by humility, in that I would say, I don't know. I can't tell you about mega churches.
Okay.
I can tell you about working at Saddleback Church, which I know is a mega church. I think I've had enough friends that have worked at other mega churches to know that I think at times that move to kind of um, frame mega churches with kind of all the same qualities, values, characteristics, cultural dynamics is I think pretty unfair and unreasonable.
Okay.
And it would be like saying, well, you're in a medium-sized church, and we all know what medium-sized churches are like. What is that?
Yeah.
So I please don't hear me wrong. I don't want to dismiss.
Yeah.
I think some of the maybe research and work that has been done on commonalities and
Hmm.
common dynamics of mega churches and large churches. But I think what I would just say is I've had enough friends work at other mega churches and heard about their experience
Yeah.
and their experience of what it was like to work within that maybe ecosystem of a large institution to know, sometimes there's similarities, but oftentimes there's like significant differences. And again, I think my experience also, I just want to recognize, is fairly unique. I grew up in Rick Warren's household.
Yeah.
My weekends as a teenager were spent hanging out in his home. So when I go to work for him, right, there's this kind of high level of relationality and
Yeah.
investment. And I recognize that is fairly unique, and even was unique for many folks who worked at Saddleback with me, who
Yeah.
didn't have near the kind of interaction and relationship and relational equity that I
Yeah.
did with Rick. And so I think for me, working at Saddleback I really felt blessed, and kind of commissioned to embrace my vocation in its fullness there. And I really felt like I was given a ton of just remarkable freedom
Hmm.
to invest in the life of the church in ways that I really felt passionate about and felt called to. So I think I'm willing to keep exploring that with you. If I don't mean
No,
to dodge the question, but
not at all. And it
yeah.
wasn't at all a gotcha. Like, I would say there was a season when I was kind of intrinsically like, mega church as a concept is like not church, but I backed off that a bit, primarily because I've spoken at several mega churches, gotten to know the leadership,
Yeah.
and yes, the stereotype of it just being, cranking out services, all you cared about is just putting on a good show. You don't care about like the poor, and it's all about performance. Like, I'm sure that for sure that exists, probably in any size church. But I've met some of the most humble, godly, caring pastors that are pastors of mega churches who don't think highly of themselves. I know several mega churches, one I'm thinking in particular in Missouri, that gives away a ton of money to the poor. They're very involved in their community. They've helped tons of people get out of like medical debt, and they're just a massive positive influence in the community. They have a positive reputation. The pastors are humble, And so I think I don't think size alone determines the health of the church. I think
Yeah.
each size can have its own unique challenges, but I don't think just because you have a small church, therefore you're not going to have, the problems that a megachurch might have.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I definitely observed that at Saddleback during my years there, both my developmental years growing up and my years there working as a pastor. That church, profoundly generous,
Hmm.
focused on the community, remarkably compassionate and caring,
Hmm.
in really like kind of like put your money where your mouth is kind of ways. And I mean, the legacy of Celebrate Recovery out of that
Yeah,
place
right. Yeah.
is remarkable. But when I was there working, they have what was called the Peace Center, and every day there were many people cycling through that place to get all kinds of basic health medical services for free, food, resources in a whole host of ways, even some
Wait,
legal
peace
services.
peace center. I thought you said peace center. I thought it was
Ah,
I thought it was a name for
oh
like
no.
the
Oh
bathroom or
boy.
something. Okay,
I'm glad you
peace
clarified. I don't
peace
want anybody
center.
else hearing it that way. The Peace Center. I rolled those two words together probably too quickly on my tongue. Yeah. So I watched a church that, as you're describing, cared for the
Yeah.
marginalized, the forgotten, and it in really beautiful ways. And maybe the last thing I would just say is, over the years, I've often, I think because of some of my writing, in particular, probably The Way of the Dragon, The Way of the Lamb, I tend to get questions about, oh, you wrote a book about power in the church and you worked
Yeah.
at a mega church. Like,
Yeah.
so what weren't you saying in the book? And why did you, and what I would say is, oh man, in my experience as a pastor, and again, I can only speak to my experience, but for me, the temptation for kind of power to control and power for self-glory, oh boy, it was just as much there in a living room of 40 high schoolers hanging on my every word as a 22-year-old getting started in ministry, as it was at Saddleback, as I was leading kind of large retreats and given a bigger platform of opportunity to speak and to write in some ways there. And so I don't want to say that the size of the platform or the size of the influence and opportunity can't exponentially can't kind of exponentialize the impact of unhealthy forms of power and worldly power. It can, but all to say, you can embrace worldly power and embrace leveraging the church for your own glory in a medium-sized church, in a small church, in a youth group meeting, in a living room, just as much as you can in a large church environment. And so I think sometimes that's often, I think, the concern or the critique. And I understand, because that may be some people's experience and I don't want to dismiss that. But all I can speak to is my own kind of journey with being tempted with power of ministry, and say, oh boy, the temptation was real there for me, especially in my young years. When things started going well in youth ministry started growing a little bit, you count the numbers that you have. And if you go from 15 to all of a sudden 45, man, all right, that's your reference point. So yeah, that maybe some other thoughts and reflections.
Yeah. I've only had a couple conversations with Rick Warren. One on the podcast and one, was that the only one? No, we've had some email exchanges and stuff. That guy has more bandwidth in energy than anybody he's like inhuman. Is that real? I mean, I don't think he sleeps much. I don't think he needs a lot of sleep, but that guy just, he told me that there was one Christmas where I think he personally preached like 17 services or something, and probably got up early the next morning and started writing a book or something. I mean, the guy is just insane. Yeah. Is that reality? I mean,
yeah. What I would say is, in recent years, just I think with age and as for all of us, there's been some ways he's kind of had to slow down, and he's had some more limitations. But yeah, my experience of him over the course of a lifetime is he just has a motor unlike anybody. And, having myself now 20 years in pastoral ministry, having myself now been in several contexts where I've preached 3 times or even 4 times. I just recently was guest preaching in a church, invited to preach up in Sacramento, and I preached 3 services. And before the 3rd service, Preston, I was sitting in the back in the green room, and I was doing one of those like, all right, okay, you can do it. and what's interesting is my mind went to Rick. This is funny you bring this up. My mind went to Rick, and I thought, man, how did he do that? How did he do that? Because
every week,
because my experience growing up, 4 or 5 services was just standard. In fact, when I was growing up, it was 5 services, I believe, every Sunday. And and it wasn't like that was all he was doing. As you
Yeah.
mentioned, writing books, leading, and what I've always known of him, and these are the maybe quieter parts that others don't see, but I knew him to be the guy who showed up in the hospital room late at night with people in the
Mm,
life of the church, and that's still the case.
wow.
And so, he, at any rate, yeah, he just
Mm,
has a remarkable motor,
yeah.
unlike maybe anybody I've ever met. Actually, I mean, I met
Yeah.
some pretty high energy, high engagement, high capacity people, but I think Rick might beat them all.
And I think he's got a list of, I don't know, thousands of people that he prays for.
Oh
Like
yeah,
he, and that's, yeah, it's, I was at a small little pastor gathering, maybe 30 people. This is probably, gosh, maybe 20 years ago. And at the end, he wanted a picture with every single one of us because he said, "I'm going to pray for
yep,
you." And I remember
yep.
somebody that knew him kind of nudged me and says, he actually will, and he'll remember your name.
For sure. Yeah, no, like in fact, I do still work with him now in a different capacity. I run something called the Healthy Pastor Initiative
Hmm.
with his ministry finishing the task. And I do retreats for pastors and kind of soul care work for pastors,
Hmm.
helping pastors finish the race of ministry well alongside this objective of finishing the task, Great Commission. But I mean, just a few weeks ago, I'm in a meeting with him, and the conversation is, and when I'm at these conferences and I'm doing these things, I want to make sure we're capturing photos of folks and getting their
Hmm.
information. And this isn't, I can tell you, having known the man my whole life, this isn't primarily for, marketing purposes or,
Hmm.
email dump. He's wanting to maintain connection with people,
Hmm.
and he's wanting to maintain connection with people for the sake of care, but primarily for the sake of prayer. And he still
Wow.
has that. He's always had that. So that personal investment in people's lives. I mean, he was the he was the guy in between all those services. I mean, I marvel this now, right? Because when I'm growing up as a kid, it's like I just don't recognize it for what it is until I'm doing ministry. But he was the guy who was out on the patio having as
Hmm.
many conversations, giving as many hugs as he could before the next service started, and
Wow.
maybe even into the next service a little bit, and then being told, "Hey, you gotta get up and preach again." Right? So man, he just shepherding in a very personal, intimate way. Prayer, as you said, meeting
Hmm.
people in dark hours of their life and moving towards people in their homes and in hospital rooms. And Rick,
Hmm.
Rick, Rick was a pastor,
Wow.
and yeah, I
Hmm.
marvel at the energy and the capacity
Yeah.
to do that.
Hey, friends, I want to tell you about a new sponsor for Theology in Raw. It's called Everyday Dose, which is coffee with mushrooms, collagen, and nootropics. It's kind of like coffee with benefits. So, like probably most of you, I love coffee, and I also love to be healthy and stay alert. With Everyday Dose, I can do both. Everyday Dose combines high quality coffee with powerful ingredients like lion's mane and chaga, collagen protein, and nootropics to fuel your brain, boost focus, and give you clean, sustained energy all day long. It tastes just like coffee, but without the downsides. There's no crash, jitters, just clean, sustained energy. So if you struggle with focus, productivity, or efficiency, or maybe you have ADHD and are looking for tools to help you, then check out Everyday Dose. Right now for Black Friday, you can get 61% off your first Coffee Plus starter kit, a free A2 probiotic creamer, and over $100 in free gifts. Plus, you can enter for a chance to win $100 cash or get your entire order refunded. Visit everydaydose.com/TITR or use code TITR at checkout. Okay, that's everydaydose.com/TITR or use TITR at checkout. So you've moved from full-time pastoral ministry to now you're a professor, you're an academic, but you're
Mhm,
also involved in pastoral care.
mhm.
Um, what are as you're caring for other pastors, what are some of the greatest, most common concerns, challenges, needs that come up among pastors these days?
Yeah. Oh, I think what I've noticed over the last year, in particular over the last year, I've been doing retreats various places for kind of groups of pastors. And so London, Indiana, Seattle, Arizona. So a pretty broad spectrum. And what I've noticed to be really, I think, common threads and themes are probably things that aren't terribly surprising. Loneliness,
Mm.
exhaustion, um, discouragement. Um, but I, I think maybe what I would say is in those things, what I think I've begun to really identify is for many pastors, there's just what I would call a lament long overdue.
Mm.
Um, there have been betrayals.
Mm-hmm.
There have been hurtful, kind of sustained criticisms of them and their ministry.
Mm-hmm.
There have been serious losses, whether that's actually the death of those that are dear to them in the life of the church, or losses in other ways. You're just kind of watching people just kind of ghost to church and walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that many pastors, in a very noble and honorable way, maintain a really high degree of confidentiality about their experience of those things
Mm.
that I think actually, as much as there's virtue in there, I think there's a little bit of vice that shows up in
Mm.
not actually drawing you to the Lord in the real pain and grief and even anger that can come from some of those experiences, and sharing those things with others that God has placed in their life to actually walk with them, whether that's their fellow elders, whether that's co-pastors, or oftentimes even a spouse. And so I've sat in circles with pastors over the last year numerous times, and created some space, maybe in a retreat setting, to consider these areas in their life and how they experience ministry, prayerfully inviting them into that, and then maybe closing the day with some sharing. And what I've been struck by every time is so often the sharing begins with, I've never told anyone this, but or I've only told my wife, but I haven't really even told her how much this. And
Mm.
so often, Preston, it's a story from a decade ago, a story
Oh,
from
wow.
20 years ago, of like, man, this mentor of mine, he was supposed to send me out and I was being raised up to plant. And actually, what happened was he began to be envious of my growing young adult ministry, or he
Oh,
began
wow.
to feel jealous that actually the people he was going to send us with, he actually decided, I don't know that I want to send those people anymore. Why do they want to support you? And in the end, we were kind of shuffled out the door with a kind of vague commission, but the things that were committed to maybe in the background all were kind of like relinquished, right? Or well, I did ministry for years and years and years, and I took the risk of actually being honest and vulnerable with someone I did ministry with, and it was used against me, right? As a way for them to kind of maybe usurp my authority or to position themselves with an elder. But so you name it,
Yeah.
right? With stories of pain. And then I think lastly, I'll just say, and whatever comes up for you here, but I think the other thing I would say is what I've observed is so many pastors who are living what I would call unconfessed lives.
Mm.
And I think there's a complex story there as to why, and we can get into that a little bit if you like, but I think part of what has happened over the last decade or so, as there's been a real, what I would call, divine reckoning of sin among
Mm.
pastors and leaders in the church, and as blogs and social media has done their work in identifying those folks, and naming those folks and exposing those folks, I
Mm-hmm.
think pastors have become more and more fearful of being honest about any sin in their life,
Mm.
even sin that is certainly not disqualifying. And so they're kind
Mm.
of languishing in hidden sin, sometimes before the Lord. Like they're not even really meaningfully bringing their sin before the Lord, but certainly not in conversation with anybody else.
Mm.
And so maybe there's envy, maybe there's anger, maybe there's pride, and they're kind of trying to manage that on their own. Um, and as you know, that doesn't tend to go well, especially over the course of a life, our own
Right.
sin management.
Yeah.
So I find that there's also a confession long overdue for many pastors,
Is that what
Yeah.
led you? So you just came up with this book, Pastoral Confessions, The Healing Path to Faithful Ministry. You talk about some pretty daring topics here: pastoral pride,
Mhm.
pastoral wrath, lust, gluttony,
Mm.
envy, avarice. I can't even pronounce this one. Pastoral acedia,
Acadia. Yeah,
Acadia. What is that?
you can say it either way. This is one of those, no one knows exactly how to say the word acedia or Acadia. This is the original root word in the Christian tradition for sloth, actually.
Oh,
Yeah, but it funds. I think it funds a little bit richer understanding of the vice than sloth tends to for us. That's why I try to return to kind of the original
huh.
source word.
When
Yeah.
I think of pastors, I don't think of sloth. Usually, I think they're overworked,
Hmm.
underpaid, doing more than they should. Is that?
Hmm.
I mean, but is there
Well,
a element
yeah.
of
Well,
sloth built into there that's kind of hidden? Or
yeah. I think you can be a busybody and be slothful. I
hmm.
think you can. I think you can be highly productive and efficient in various ways and be slothful. So in the Christian tradition, what we would say is sloth is most fundamentally about being, if we're going to use the word lazy in faith, hope, and love.
Huh.
And think here of maybe the scene with Mary and Martha. You're busy with much, but you failed
Mm.
to do the one thing
Oh yeah.
necessary, right? And I think there are many pastors who are very diligent in leadership development, in preparing for their sermons, and they are avoiding actually engaging with people in their church and caring for souls that are difficult, because love in real life can be really difficult and inefficient.
It's almost like
So
hiding behind the busyness of ministry and
yeah,
not
certainly.
being lazy toward or slothful
Hmm.
towards
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
more
Yeah, I
crucial
mean,
work.
thinking really maybe practical ways, even for folks that might be listening who aren't pastors. I
Mm.
try to explore each of these vices in a way that also you can maybe discern them in your own life, whether you're in ministry as well in the book. And I think this is maybe the person who they're late on paying bills, and it's the month of April, and they still haven't really engaged those taxes,
Mm.
but they're going to spend all Saturday cleaning the house, because the truth is the house does need to get cleaned.
Hmm.
Right? So what's really going on there, right? There's an
Yeah.
unwillingness to engage and be responsible with actually what is most maybe
Mm.
essential and necessary and critical and important.
Yeah.
But someone else in their life might go, oh man, they're so organized, they're so clean, they're so responsible. They might walk in their home and go, wow, this is definitely somebody who doesn't struggle with sloth.
Mhm.
But what may be going on is there's a pile of papers in the closet that
Mm.
lie underneath the basket that they're not
Yeah.
dealing with, right? And I think I can speak from experience that can show up
Yeah.
in the pastoral life. So that's part of what Acadia is getting at. There can be a slothful component, and that can show up in the kind of sluggard of Proverbs, just an unwillingness to engage. But it can also show up in a kind of busyness in all kinds of things to avoid what is actually most central to our vocation. But
Mm.
on the other side of Acadia can kind of be, and this is why I like the word Acadia. Acadia really, what it really just means is a failure to care, ultimately. And how
Hmm.
it can also kind of manifest is through a kind of despondence. So maybe rather than showing up more slothfully, or it can show up as a just kind of resignation, like what's the point anymore?
Hmm.
Why try?
Is that
And
pretty common among pastors? That kind of like apathy,
oh,
borderline nihilism, just kind of like I need to
I
keep cranking out my sermons and services because my paycheck depends on it. But man, my heart is just not here anymore.
yeah, I think in particular, and I try to do this in the book. I try to name how these sins have shown up in my life first. I
Okay.
think one of the ways that I've seen it in my own life, but I've seen it with other pastors as well, is I think, boy, if you've been in ministry for any length of time, you've been through these rounds of trying to get the church to care about things you care about.
Mm-hmm.
And you go to conferences and you can hear hero stories about that, right? We did this initiative and everybody did it. But most pastors have the experience of, if they've done ministry for a length of time, yeah, there may be a few kind of wins in that kind of category for them, but there have been a lot of, we set forward to do this initiative to care for the poor in our city, calling people to invest in something. Maybe this isn't even building campaign. This is just, we really believe our church ought to be about this. We're trying to create a new partnership with churches in India in some meaningful way. And it could be really good work that is right at the heart of what the pastor cares deeply about. And there's a real vulnerability in sharing maybe that vision or that sense of what the Lord might be calling us to. Their heart is really attached to that. And yet they can experience the church just not really caring and not responding and not kind of showing up in ways that they would have expected, or ways that really make that thing go. And I think when you experience that several times over the course of your life in ministry, what can happen is at some point you can kind of go, yeah, what's the point?
Yeah, I can totally see that.
Yeah. So, and I think that shows up with evangelism, right? I think it can show up in a kind of, we've got our 80 people here, and boy, I've done this for 20 years. And as soon as we start building and growing, I get that 6-person family leaving, and all of a sudden we're down to 74 out of 80. And then I get one maybe new family coming, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to kind of batten down the hatches. I'm going to try to kind of just keep what I've got and just kind of ride this thing out. And yeah. So I think that's some of the ways it can show up.
What does pastoral confession look like? Because this is kind of a main thing you're arguing, is this should be part of the discipline of pastoral ministry, as pastors should be confessing sin, being open with their struggles. But I guess if I could say, could that, I imagine, every time a pastor looks at porn or something, he's like confessing before the church, before his sermon. And that could be, I don't know, like, is that what you're arguing for? Or like, what?
No. I say this in the book, I hopefully really clearly in a full-throated way, that like, here I am, I'm publishing a book on pastoral confession, and I am confessing my own sins first. But I want to be really clear. What I'm not suggesting is, and now every pastor should follow me and publish their sins, right, in a book, or needs to get up at every conference and confess their sins. But I felt a sense of conviction that if I'm going to call other pastors to do this, I do have to go first. And what does it mean to write a book on pastoral confession and just talk the whole time about how I'm tempted by things?
Right.
Like, okay, well, when are you going to really let it rip and tell us what your actual sins, present tense, not past tense, which is a common temptation for pastors, is to only confess in the past tense as a kind of hero's tale of having overcome these things, right? And so,
or confess socially acceptable sins, like, hey,
certainly,
I'm strong. The church is exploding in growth, and
really
we're just
hard.
crushing it, and I just want to confess it's starting. I'm feeling prideful, and like, that's different than I'm confessing that I wish I would have been a woman and I cross-dress sometimes, or like.
Well, I think to your point, it can land somewhat like responding to that classic interview question, like, tell us your weakness. And you go, I'd have to say it's that I care too much and I work too hard. That's my weakness, and it's like, we all know what we're doing here, right? Like I've actually told you a strength, and you're like, well done. We want somebody who overworks. Okay. So I think you're right. There's all kinds of ways we dodge confession. I just wanting to signal out the gate as I answer your question. This is not a book calling pastors to all write their book, publishing their confessions, or to get up on every Sunday morning and confess their sins. It is a call to pastors to embrace, I think, what is fundamentally a call in the Christian life. And pastors, they don't have an opt-out clause, right? Confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you might be healed. And I don't take it that James 5:16 has like an addendum, unless you're in full-time ministry, then don't do it. In fact, as I argue in the book, if we're going to invite people into this kind of gospel practice in their life of mortification of sin, that there is actually healing to be found in presenting the truth of our sin before the Lord. If we're going to really meaningfully invite people into that, I think we have to be people who know that way ourselves and know what it is to live by grace in our own lives, not just commending a gospel to them that we don't know experientially. And so I think this is actually essential for pastors to faithfully shepherd others in the way of Jesus. I do think there's challenges, no doubt, to what that looks like in a pastor's life. And I also try to name that in the book, recognizing that, we are in a different position in the life of the church, holding an office. And so what does it mean to take up that fundamental Christian calling, but in light of our office and in light of maybe our unique context in the church? And there I just would want to pause and say, well, that's a great place to begin, is to take seriously that question. Like, what does that look like? And to bring that into prayer with the Lord. Like, Lord, okay, I think this is actually something I'm called to along with all the believers here in our church. So what does it mean for me to embrace this call to confess my sins to one another, to do a one another in scripture faithfully, for the sake of healing? What does it mean that I actually need the prayers of others, just like others need the prayers of myself and others, for the sake of our healing? And where might I begin? And what I would just commend to pastors is to say, begin there, and begin there with a conversation with fellow elders, fellow pastors in the
Okay.
life of your church. And I think the right place to start, and just to use one example, I know this isn't everybody's ecclesial context, but this was mine for so many years, and I know it is many who are probably listening. What it would look like to begin the conversation in the elder room with, hey, I think this is something we're probably called to do. And it probably needs to begin here together with one another as those who are genuine peers in ministry and who are called to actually hold one another accountable and actually called to discern whether we're qualified or disqualified for our office.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty hard to do that if we actually don't know about each other's lives and don't
Mm.
actually know about each other's sins. Are we just kind of waiting to find out if someone gets caught doing something terrible? Like, that seems like a bad way to approach this. And so, hey, can we just begin with what would that look like for us? And can we begin with honestly just acknowledging we're all kind of scared to do it? Like, if we
Mm.
haven't done that before, hey, I just want to begin with, I think this is something we're called to do. But if I'm honest, I'm scared to be vulnerable in those ways. And I'm scared to be vulnerable for the same reason every Christian is scared to be vulnerable. And in the kind of how the fall has hit us in Adam, I think we see in Genesis 3 the same pattern of behavior and guilt and in shame and fear. We're scared of condemnation. We're scared of abandonment and rejection by God, in fact, still in many ways, which is why I think we don't always give a full-throated confession to the Lord, even in prayer. It can be a kind of very generic, oh God, I sinned again. Thanks. Sorry. Bye.
Yeah.
Move on. But I think also why we're scared to confess with others is we're scared of the same thing in interpersonal relationship. So what I would commend to pastors is begin there. I think this is
Okay.
something we're called to do. What would it look like for us to take scripture seriously? If I'm honest, I feel a bit scared to do that. And I
Yeah.
don't think there's anything in my life that is maybe disqualifying, but I'm worried that you all might hear any sin as disqualifying. As I say in the book, if sinlessness was the qualification for pastoral office, well, none would be found qualified. And so I think what I find is oftentimes pastors have opted for the next, and they know, every pastor knows that. Of course I have sinned. And everyone goes, well, of course the pastor sins. But I think what we've opted for is something like, yeah, but let's just pretend like he doesn't. And
Yeah.
I'll just keep pretending like I don't. And I think that way of life, that's what produces 20 years later a moral failure
Mm.
that sows profound devastation and destruction in church, right? Like, the story of adultery usually doesn't begin with that in a
Right.
person's life. There's a long story of hidden sins that probably began in ways that were not disqualifying at all, but were not brought meaningfully into the light of God's presence, and were not brought meaningfully into the fellowship community of the saints, such that
Yeah.
others can walk with us in that in a meaningful way. So
Yeah.
what I'm trying to commend here is hopefully a way of life and vitality for pastors who can actually persevere in ministry faithfully over the long
Yeah.
haul. I think we've got to confess.
Once you begin with that kind of behind closed doors select group of leaders, like that alone can be really scary
Definitely.
and challenging. Is there a place for confessing from the pulpit, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think so, Preston. And maybe let me just briefly say here too, for some pastors, I recognize their elder room might currently be a place that they know to not be safe to share their life
Right.
really in any way. And so for them, I'd say, then start the conversation with a fellow pastor who's not in your context, and begin the same conversation there.
Mhm.
Hey, this is where I'm at. I think this is something we're called to do. And if I'm honest, I'm scared to do it in my own church context. Can you help discern that with me? And can I begin confessing my sins to you, perhaps? Can we do that
Mm.
together? Can you help me discern how to maybe bring this into my elder room? Because I don't even know if I can do that. So I want to pause there and just again
Sure.
acknowledge there's first steps that I'd want to commend. To begin where you are, but begin with an earnest intention to be faithful to God's call in this regard. Now,
Mm.
I think having said that, what I would say is a couple things. Yeah, don't begin in the pulpit, right? Like don't roll out the first confession in the pulpit. And I think one, for the reasons I've already mentioned, I think it's actually not really honoring and properly recognizing of where that should start and who should be kind of co-discerners of qualification for office. And
Mhm.
I take it we don't get to kind of self-select in that regard. I think we are all deceived enough. The heart is deceitful and wicked above all else. Who can know it? I take it we don't always know our hearts well. We don't always know the truth of our sin. And so we need to bring into the elder room or fellow pastors first, actually, because there does need to be some discernment about what is
Yeah.
the degree of my sin. I don't get to decide it's not that serious or it is that serious.
Mhm.
And so I don't think rolling into the pulpit is the first place to go for those reasons. And I do find sometimes when that has happened, it is a way of avoiding what I've just said, right? Because
Mm.
sometimes I can position even a confession of my sin almost through the story of victimhood
Yeah.
and garners sympathy in a way that is manipulative and actually gets the congregation on my side, so that by the time I do bring it
Mm.
into the elder room, the congregation is like, oh, we just feel bad for him and we want to do whatever it takes to care for our pastor. And now the elders are going, oh boy, but like he shouldn't be a pastor anymore, you know? And I mean, I've seen that happen. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing I'd want to say. Beyond that, what I would say, maybe just giving a more positive case for, let's say you've already, you know, you're honest about your life and even your sin with those who you first and foremost should be fellow elders, fellow pastors, your spouse, close friends who would hold you accountable. Now, what does it look like to begin showing up in the pulpit in kind of the truth of your life? I do think there needs to be discernment here about how detailed we get about
Mm.
about our sin, but I do think there is value in pastors showing up in the pulpit, being honest about what I would just say ought to be a meaningful part of every sermon preparation plan every week they prepare to enter into the pulpit. In my opinion, every time I prepare for a sermon, part of that should include confession of sin in
Mm.
some way.
Wow.
If the word of the Lord is dividing and searching and knowing my heart, I take it that every time I'm confronted by the word, my heart should be exposed. And there ought to be things that the Lord is actually showing me about my own life
Mm.
and places of failure and sin. And I take it that part of preparing to preach that Sunday is, oh, Lord, me too. Here's
Mm.
where there's pride in my life. Here's where I know there's anger. Here's where I know there can be self-righteousness, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And I think that can help fund, I think, occasions in which this might actually be really helpful and appropriate to share in the sermon as a way of inviting others to do the same. I think if the congregation is only ever hearing the pastor talk about how they have sin, oh, all right, or if the pastor's only story about sin in his life is, my life is, 20 years ago, I used to struggle with this. I think
Right.
what can begin to be created is a sense that actually the pastor's kind of arrived, I guess,
Mm.
and there's a whole host of problems there. But one of the problems there is, I think what that can begin to communicate to people is I guess something's wrong with me. I've been trying to do this Christian life thing and take it seriously for years, and I really don't want some of these sins in my life. But here I am 25 years later, and I'm still struggling with these things. But apparently, Jamin doesn't. I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. Am I doing something wrong? Have I like,
Mm.
and so I think confession is an opportunity in the same way we might use an image or a story in a
Yeah.
sermon. A confession, I think, is an opportunity to say, here's what the gospel looks like in our real life. Here's how the Lord has met me in my own anger. And
Mm.
boy, that's something that I still wrestle with
Mm.
today in my life. And
Yeah.
that can show up in my home. And I those moments in sermons for me, when I have done that over the years, I would say, but every time I have had someone approach me afterwards and say, Thank you for saying that.
Hmm.
Sometimes I wonder, like
Yeah.
what I just described, like, is this just, I guess I'm just the one, like pastors kind of figured it out. And you, like, you really gave me hope and encouragement that like, this is the journey. This is the pilgrimage of faith.
Yeah.
It's going to include this. And, um, so anyway,
Yeah.
I think offering a vision for them of what it means to live by grace through faith alone, and our need for God's forgiveness to be met in places of actual sin in our life. I think we have to articulate that about our own lives if we're going to invite people into that in their life.
Okay, I'm turning 50 years old next year. I can't believe it. And I'm already feeling the effects of aging. I mean, our bodies simply make less energy as we get older, but now you can help recharge the batteries of your cells by taking Modapure's longevity gummies, which transform cellular damage into energy by delivering 6 times more urolithium A than a glass of pomegranate juice. Modapure is the only urolithium A supplement on the market clinically proven to target the effects of age-related cellular decline. And now you can take this powerful supplement in gummy form. That's right, the first ever longevity gummies powered by Modapure make it easier to put energy into your day. The longevity gummies will increase your sustained energy, boost muscle endurance, and support faster recovery after exercise. If you want to stay strong and energized now as you age, then you have to try these Modapure gummies. And my friends over at Timeline are offering my listeners a free sample of the new Modapure gummies. Just head over to timeline.com/theology gummies to get started. That's timeline.com/theology gummies. Your cells will thank you. I think just having that posture of vulnerability too, like which is, I guess, adjacent to confession. Obviously, you have to be vulnerable to be willing to confess, but that just, I don't know, man. Like you totally know when people are being genuinely vulnerable, or
Mhm.
like you said before, they're just working the room. They're
Mhm.
using kind of pseudo vulnerability to gain more, you know, more followers, more allegiance.
Sure.
And yeah, at the same time, like it is a fine balance between not presenting yourself as untouchable, like you're doing everything right, obviously. But
Right.
then if you're just living in, you know, you're so vulnerable and confessing so often that people are like, why? Yeah. Are you a
Mhm.
leader that I should be submitting to and
Yeah.
following? Like,
Yeah.
it's that, I
I
don't know. It's that kind of
yeah.
in between space that I
I
find
do
to be
think here
helpful.
of the apostle, and I think this is a matter of wisdom and discernment, right? I don't
Yeah.
think there's a kind of like, what are the 5 rules of
Yeah.
proper confession and in the pulpit? But I do think of Paul here as a model for us.
Hmm.
And is he just being hyperbolic, or just trying to make other people feel okay when he says, "Here I am, chief of sinners"?
Right.
Um, it's interesting the ways we sometimes read Paul's list of weaknesses and struggles in Corinthians. In there he says he struggles every day with anxiety for the churches,
Hmm.
and I find we so often like are quick to do a kind of like interesting. Well, this is clearly like a healthy version of anxiety because, of course, as we all know, Paul can't have sin. Wait, what? I'm sorry. What? Like we have this interesting way of perfecting biblical characters other than Christ in ways that I think tend to be.
Hmm.
This is really common with Old Testament figures, as you know, right? Like
Right.
we get really dodgy about the actual sins,
Hmm.
and I think we can do that with. And I wonder, as Paul's talking about his anxiety for the churches, the same guy who said, be anxious for nothing.
Hmm.
Um, I, could it be that he's acknowledging he struggles with trusting the Lord? Is that possible? It certainly seems possible, right? Like, I don't think Paul was without sin.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll just say, I think some of this is maybe part and parcel of how we experience even some of the ways Paul talks about ministry in his life. And I think there's a mirroring there of how he talks about his weaknesses. Similarly, I think pastors really struggle to be honest just about weaknesses, right? Working your
Hmm.
strengths, working your sweet spot, and we tend to virtualize that. And Vision Sundays and Leadership Sundays don't tend to be sharing about the weaknesses of the church and sharing about the weaknesses of our leadership. I guess I would just say, Well, why not? It's very interesting to me
Hmm.
that Paul's response to the Corinthians' critique of his rhetorical skill is basically a yeah. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a, you know what? Thank you for the critical feedback. I'll work on that. I know I need to be a better speaker. And don't worry, I'm going to make that a strength, not a weakness. Rather, it's, yeah, when I'm weak, I'm strong. May Christ be glorified. Would that you
Hmm.
know that Christ is the one doing this, not me. And so let me give you there in 2 Corinthians 11 a whole laundry list of other weaknesses. Actually, oh, you think my speaking ability is not as impressive as the other traveling super apostles? Oh, you think the fact that I don't take money is to my shame, because of course the teachers worth their salt take money. You guys don't know the half of it. Let me give you a whole list of other really embarrassing things about myself. Let me tell you a story about being lowered out of a basket late at night. You think it's embarrassing I can't march into town with a parade. Oh, I have to like hide. I have to sneak out of town late at night, right? I mean, Preston, right? These are not, Paul isn't putting forward like the best profile of an apostle, right? Who's
Hmm.
sinless, who never struggles with anxiety, who's always up for anything, and um, never struggles, never feels pain. Like, this isn't.
Hmm.
And so I guess I would just commend to pastors, like, what would it look like to kind of maybe follow Paul's example here as he follows Christ?
Hmm. That's good. That's good. I want to shift gears just a little bit, because you've been a pastor, you're a forward-thinking person, and you work with tons of pastors. Given the massive cultural shifts from internet to pandemics to political division, do you envision pastoral ministry taking on a different shape today in 2025 and moving
Mm.
on than we were doing 30 years ago? Um, how much a
Mm.
pastoral ministry should resist cultural change, and how much of it should adopt and embrace and shift their pastoral approach in light of cultural change? I mean, the one big one for me is so much of
Mm.
influence is now, for good or for ill, is online. It's Zoom chats, it's podcasts, it's YouTube, it's all these things that are not just face to face embodied sort of ministry. Whereas, 30 years ago, a pastoral influence was just, or mainly, Sunday sermon, maybe a Bible study, maybe whatever, but it was
Mhm.
there. But people now are getting so much influence, again, for good or for ill, outside of, listening to the pastor's pulpit ministry. So
Yeah.
yeah, what sort of ecclesiological changes should we adopt, and how many should we keep?
Yeah. Wow, what a question. It's great.
Sorry to drop that. I know you didn't write a
No,
book on this, but
no, it's great. I'm happy to just kind of prayerfully think out loud with you a little bit about it. I think the first thing that comes up for me is just to say, well, I definitely don't want to begin the conversation with a kind of like Luddite rejection of all things while I'm on a podcast talking to you. Right? Like, this feels like the
I'm a
height of
little biased. I'm a little biased.
this feels like the height of hypocrisy. Like, oh, we really shouldn't be doing these podcasts, except for me. So I think I just would want to begin even there, like half jokingly, but maybe half also serious, to say I, I want to recognize the kind of variegated nature of pastoral calling in this sense. Um, I think we do get a fixed sense of what is fundamental to the pastoral vocation. I think fairly clear in the New Testament,
Mhm.
and proclaiming the gospel, the kind of teaching vocation of the pastorate, shepherding God's people, as to say, caring for souls,
Yeah.
yeah, in protection and provision and guidance, all that a shepherd would do in a person's life. And I think prayer, being committed to a life of prayer for the sake of the church, for people we're caring for. These things I think are fundamentally at the heart of the
Mhm.
pastoral vocation, and the kind of ordered worship, administration of sacraments, depending on our tradition
Right.
here. But I think pastors are responsible for shepherding and teaching in and through the worship of God's people, gathering God's people. So these things I think are fixed, and yet I think um, individual pastors are called, meaning Jamin is called to the pastorate, Preston is called to, whoever it is, this individual is called. And so, for example, in my case, I have a couple master's degrees, but I went on to do that PhD, and I don't think that's like necessary. And I think doing the seminary degree, I highly commend that. I'm an associate professor at Talbot Seminary at Biola. Please come, But I don't think beyond that master's or that MDiv, which I think can be really important and helpful for pastors and in being faithful to those parts of their vocation we just talked about. I don't think it was necessary for me to get a PhD. Okay, so then what does it mean to be a pastor who does have a PhD? Right? Well, maybe there's now a certain particular responsibility or kind of uniqueness to my calling that does entail things like writing books or creating resources for other pastors or developing theological content that can help train and equip even other pastors and ministry leaders. Well, I don't think that's essential to every pastor's role. So I think what I'm getting at here, to then move more directly to answering your question, is I think I don't want to ever, leave behind what is fundamental. And if the pull towards starting a podcast, writing books, speaking at conferences, leaning into kind of new technologies and the ways in which those maybe kind of globalize our, as you said, influence or impact or ministry, if that's pulling me away from what is, I think, fundamental and central to the vocation that isn't particularized to me, that's not shaped by my unique story, my unique gifting, my unique training and equipping, then something has gone awry. Like, either I'm going to continue to be a local pastor who shepherds a particular people in a particular place and actually knows those lives and who preaches to a particular people in a particular place. Like, this is, I think, one of the distinctives of preaching. It is to a people whom we live amongst and who we do life with and who we know. Right. And I think if those things are pulling me out of that, well, then I think something has to be discerned at that point. Am I called to still be a local church pastor and to minister and shepherd the particular people in a particular place? Well, that's going to necessitate personal relationship, interaction, face-to-face, embodied ministry, knowing lives that I'm preaching to, praying for people by name, all the things we've talked about. And it may be the case that God's now 20, 30 years in or whatever it may be. No, he's calling me into something new and something different. But now I have to discern how to maybe I hold these things in relationship with one another. I think maybe the last thing I'll say is how a local church thinks about its ministry beyond its walls in and through some of these mediums of communication. I think that just needs to be really carefully discerned. I think I'm not at all allergic to the sermon is posted in a podcast audio, or the pastors have a podcast conversation about various issues in life of church. These things are pretty common now. But I would want to encourage them to think about those primarily, first and foremost, as ways of caring for yet still their church. I think if the focus becomes the camera in the back of the room for those who aren't in the room, and I'm kind of teaching towards that, something's been disordered.
Right.
If the podcast becomes actually a conversation that's not relevant at all to the church, I have found this at times where there's things happening in the culture writ large, or the evangelical church and evangelical church culture writ large, that like the pastor podcast at a local church feels like they need to talk about an address. And I think my question would be something like, is this something your people are actually wrestling with? Like, these pastoral conversations you're getting in, and is it impacting your context? Great. But if you're kind of just creating an episode to address issues that are happening other places, but no one in your church is actually wrestling with these things or talking about these things, ought it just be a podcast you guys do on the side for the church? And maybe that's something God's calling you into that's different. He's uniquely gifted you or equipped you to do that. But what does it mean to continue to remain kind of focused on shepherding your people with these resources?
Yeah. I want to advocate for not every, I never give absolutes, every ministry is different, but I think most pastors and leaders, it would be beneficial to have a conversational, down to earth podcast
Mm,
directed towards the church,
mm,
um, so that people can see a pastor outside of the performance of a sermon. And I don't mean that negatively. I'm just saying when you prepare for a sermon, there isn't, I'm not using the term performance negatively. It's just neutral. Like that is a it's scripted, it's filtered, it's edited, it's
yeah,
and it
yeah.
could be amazingly beneficial. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying in addition to that, to give people a window into
Mm,
who you are, how you talk just normally, not in a preachy way. How are you thinking through so many issues that are challenging Christians and the church? One of the biggest frustrations I hear from pastors is, they just did a 2-year series through Romans, while if they went on their social media sites of all their congregants, they're fighting about politics, they're yelling and screaming over LGBTQ stuff. They're, yelling about immigration and
mm,
how they responded to Charlie Kirk's assassination. All these things, it's like we can't address all that on a Sunday morning. And even if we did, what's the average church attendance? Twice a month or whatever. So even if you had this whole series laid out, and man,
mhm,
you're learning so much from Romans, like the people are not, they're getting a glimpse of what you have learned by going through Romans. And I'm a
mhm.
big fan of Romans, big fan of expository preaching. So I'm not saying don't do that, but man, I just feel like in this day and age, the fact is, people that we are shepherding are being, dare I say, much more heavily influenced by things outside of the Sunday morning sermon. And so, could leaders not go to where people are naturally, being influenced? And
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know.
I'm
What
very
do you think? What do you think?
no,
I'm not
yeah,
gonna write a book on this or anything. And I know I'm biased. I'm a podcast or whatever, but I just feel like, man, and I've seen
yeah,
pastors do this,
yeah,
and it's been, I think it's been great that they can address things and help shepherd people
yeah,
throughout the week, really.
yeah,
In as much as a decent percentage of people are on podcasts, but
yeah.
or YouTube, or just I'm not,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I think and again, you're catching me a bit on the fly with you thinking out
yeah,
loud, which I'm happy to do. I'm sensitive to what you're commending. I think I'm inclined to agree with you. Again, I think I would want to just help maybe draw that distinction between, um, well, maybe to give a correlative example.
okay,
Years ago at someone I served with in ministry, youth ministry, who was, kind of engaging the latest research out there
hmm,
on what's going on with teens, what teens are doing, what teens are struggling with.
right,
And, here's the percentages, here's the data, here's what the surveys are saying. And um, decided really need to do a series on like TikTok and
hmm,
the dangers
yeah,
of TikTok or whatever, um, and um, and so kind of did that smaller youth group, and after a few weeks, like he kind of just had this sense that like it wasn't really landing, and
hmm.
come to find out, like really no one in the youth group was using TikTok. And there's a bunch of like homeschool kids in the youth group. There's a bunch of who like don't even have cell phones yet. And
Huh.
okay, and so I guess it's a bit of a maybe a stark example, but that sometimes can help kind of hone in on and maybe clarify a point, which is to say,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm really open to what you're suggesting. I like the way you framed it, which is it can be a conversation with your people about things your people are actually
yeah,
wrestling with and thinking through and dynamics going on.
yes,
And it may still be, please don't hear me wrong. It may still be something that happened in the news or like, I'm not suggesting it has to be like only stories of things happening inside of our community. I just mean to say
right,
issues and questions and things your people are struggling with. And sometimes I find from my own experience, right? Us evangelical pastors, we can be online quite a bit and we can be in a bit of our own echo chamber of like the issues of the day. and the things that need to be addressed and what surveys are saying and what the research is showing and what's really going on and why people are coming and why people are going and what's dividing our churches. And I just want to say that stuff can be helpful as a kind of secondary source of discerning what you're already discerning interpersonally and prayerfully in your community. But don't ever let the research and the surveys and the kind of conversation out there in the social media space dictate what you do or don't talk to your people about, because it could be that you're trying to talk to them about TikTok and none of them are using TikTok.
Right.
and it may be a relevant issue for most evangelical churches. Right. So again, it may be that the research is all true, but I would just want to say, hey, if you're going to have that episode about TikTok, then maybe make that a separate podcast you and your buddy are hosting that's speaking into the evangelical kind of culture. But if it's going to be for your church and a research for your church, allow it to be kind of funded by those conversations and that kind of lived experience as a pastor of like, hey, boy, these are issues we know our people are wrestling with. And to your point, we know we're not always able to address even on a Sunday morning, not because we're being dodgy or avoiding it, but just it's not fitting for us to kind of roll into the pulpit every Sunday and go, well, we heard this week from 3 of you that you're wondering about these things happening, like this is not. So it becomes a helpful place to kind of help them model for them, even maybe how to think Christianly about some of these things in their life in a kind of slower paced conversational way that I think could be really helpful. Yeah.
I would say for sure, get a sense of what are your people that God has entrusted you to pastor. What are they actually wrestling with? I don't know. I think that could be as simple as like posting a really like a survey of like what are you guys wrestling with, and maybe even give them some options, politics, immigration, I don't know, those are always on my mind, but like is it sexuality, like and then just take the top kind of responses or whatever, and then think through that and address it. And I think even bringing in, again, what I wouldn't want to happen is that the podcast reinforces the kind of pastor centricity of the church, so have conversations with other leaders, other people in the congregants, people doing, every church has people doing incredible work for the kingdom outside the walls of the church that most people don't even know about. I talked to some of the, Christian businessmen or women that are their business is they're doing more pastoring in their place of business or workplace than most pastors do throughout the week in the church, and nobody knows about it, Oh, how come so-and-so has only been at church, once in the last 6 weeks? Well, yeah, because he's out, he's traveling, he's doing this, and he's having gospel conversations, like just exposing or introducing the whole church to various people in the congregation that are really further in the kingdom, to give them examples of like, oh my gosh, they're doing that. And I can, that's good for the kingdom. I don't need to just be a pastor. I can expand the kingdom by being a stay-at-home mom, disciple my kids or whatever. I think those kind of stories would be from the local church, would be amazing. But I
think it's great. I totally agree. And maybe the last thing I'd share here, as you were saying that, what was coming up for me was, I think sometimes the pastors maybe who would feel, I was trying to kind of imagine like a pastor who might feel a little bit anxious about this and not for principled reasons. I mean, that they may be out there and listening, and that's okay. But maybe just more like, I don't know that I am like up for being able to give answers on all the hot button issues of the day on a podcast regularly. I am
That's
sensitive.
fair,
I am sensitive to kind of this expectation I think more and more seem to have of pastors, that they have a matured and well-developed theological view on immigration policy ready at hand, and also on abortion rights, and also on even just a broad political theology. I mean, political theology, as a systematic theologian myself, I would say political theology, in my estimation, is one of the hardest things to do well. And it is striking to me how often we think it should just be done easily and quickly. So I just to name a few issues, but like there's a whole host of things, right? Like euthanasia and all these hot button cultural issues that they may have like an initial sense of conviction, but they haven't had time to research and stuff. And I guess what I'm driving at is this: not only would I affirm what you said, like don't feel like you have to always be the answer person. Bring on others who maybe have thought deeply and well, who
Yeah.
are voices that can be trusted for your
Well,
church.
and
But
that's kind of what I
also,
was. That's kind of what I was thinking. I didn't state it clearly. Like,
yeah,
of course, stay in your lane. Don't you're not, and it would
yeah,
actually be counterproductive for various reasons that you give the impression that you are an expert in everything, but you can,
yeah,
go find
yeah,
somebody, hopefully within your church, that does
yeah.
have some expertise in these various areas.
But maybe what I would just say is like to add to that, like I also think that in light of some of those pressures, and in light of
Mhm.
some of, I think, the pace at which we expect an answer, and like, yeah, I mean, my goodness, just the recent events with what's transpired with the
Yeah.
assassination of Charlie Kirk. And one of the things that has stood out to me is the expectation, like within seconds, you're
Yeah.
giving a full throated, very clear, thoughtful answer to something that is profoundly traumatic,
Yeah.
sorrowful, grievous, evil.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, and so, but the pace of our social media is such that we expect rapid fire answer response. And if someone is a leader or a pastor, we expect that to
Mhm.
be like really good too, and really coherent,
Right.
and
Yeah.
robust and properly nuanced in the ways we think it should or shouldn't be nuanced. And
Hmm.
wow, I think the pressure pastors can feel on that. I just want to be sensitive to. And so
That's true.
maybe
Yeah.
what I'm also trying to drive at here is I think one of the things that could be really helpful about what you're commending is, what would it look like also to be okay having conversations around these things that aren't ultimately always about giving the definitive answer? Like,
Yes. Yes.
that you could have a conversation that actually is just more geared towards modeling
Yes.
patient discernment, asking wise questions. What is it like to be prayerful in this? How do we actually work at a pace that is prayerful and walk in step with the Spirit, discerning some of these things? How do we just work at a pace that's human? I mean, our
Mhm.
technology is not moving us at a human pace and
Mhm.
processing information, right? Let
Mhm.
alone being prayerful with it and bringing it before the Lord, and being discerning and wise in how we might respond. And so I think too, on top of everything you've shared, even if you don't have other experts in your church or don't know who you'd bring on, I think it's also okay to have conversations about some things that aren't directed towards, and we're going to give you the definitive answer.
Right.
But actually, we're just trying to maybe model a little bit of how to Christianly talk, Christianly discern, Christianly ponder and ask questions about these things. And I'm not ultimately going to give you and therefore here's how you should think about it, or
Yes.
therefore here's the answer to it. And that might alleviate a little bit of the burden and the pressure for pastors of like what this might look like. But it also might be, on top of that, a really helpful thing to model for our church, that maybe they need even more than at times definitive answers about these things.
Mm.
What they're needing is to actually be shepherded in, how do I Christianly just respond to this bombardment of
Mhm.
information, and then an expectation in maybe my echo chamber online of like, I've got to have my take too. Because I think other Christians feel that pressure. They see friends posting on
Mhm.
Facebook. Oh boy, if I don't post, what do they think about me not
Mhm.
posting? Is me not posting now mean I don't care about Charlie Kirk's death, or whatever,
Right.
the issue may be? And so maybe
That's
there's an
good.
invitation just to model for folks how to prayerfully and humanly engage some of these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Anyway, yeah, sorry to open up that big can of worms here at the end. Before I let you go, can you give a shout out to Talbot Seminary where you teach? I'm a big fan of
Yeah.
Talbot. I've been there to give lectures and speak in chapel and hang out with students, and
Mhm.
I love the posture. Every school's got its problems. Okay, so I know there's some disgruntled Talbot grad saying I had a horrible experience and this professor was anyway. In my experience, having been to many different seminaries, you
Sure.
guys are doing some really, really, really good work. You blend academic rigor with pastoral sensitivity. And in my experience with the professors, you guys are really down to earth and humble. So, anyway, not to steal your thunder, but why should people consider Talbot, and what kind of programs do you guys offer? And there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for
You did,
teeing thanks for thanks for
and
teeing
you
me up.
did. Just so people know, Jamin did not tell me. He did not know this was coming. This is coming naturally
Mm.
from my heart. So
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And yeah, I consider you a friend of Talbot. I just know over the years there's so many folks you are meaningfully connected to who are my co-laborers there at the seminary. And yeah, I went to Talbot as a student, and so I've seen both sides of it, both as a student and as faculty. I'm actually newly associate professor. And what I would say is it genuinely is an honor to kind of step into, I think, what is a rich history and tradition of faithful equipping of pastors and ministry leaders for service in the church, and practically and in ways that take seriously their own formation and take seriously a need to care for their souls. We have a rigorous commitment at Talbot to the kind of character of those who come and their own personal formation. As you know, that's kind of baked into, it's one of the unique elements, kind of our spiritual formation core. And I think it's critical that we're not just training pastors and ministry leaders and folks who might come how to exegete a passage, how to preach. And these things are important, to be sure. I don't want to diminish that, but we care about who they are, the kind of people they are. And we want their experience at the seminary to not only be rigorous and properly academically challenging and illuminating as they discover maybe new scholarship in various areas and they wrestle with ideas doctrinally, but we also want them to become people of prayer, and that they graduate as those who know the Lord deeply, and who proclaim the gospel from a place of knowing God's work in their own life. So I love being a part of that work. I love the teaching. I love the mentoring. I love that we are a place that seeks to care for our students and meet them throughout their journey. And so, yeah, love for you to come join us and hang out with us. Yeah, I teach primarily our courses on pastoral care and counseling right now, but in the years to come, I may teach some in systematic theology, since I'm a systematic theologian. I may teach some of those spiritual formation core classes, but I teach all of our pastoral care and counseling kind of core. And I love doing that. It's fun. It's awesome. Fun bringing in real stories of ministry. You know, I haven't been a pastor for 20 years. Yeah. I'm able to show up in the classroom with I know the kinds of things that can roll into your office, and I know the kinds of things that can approach you right after a sermon on Sunday, and helping folks wrestle through and discern, how do we shepherd souls well, you know?
That's so important if you are training for pastoral ministry, to not just go to a place where people have amazingly academically qualified professors, although I would say it needs to be at least that, but to have academically minded pastors who have pastoral experience and a heart for the church is huge. So you guys definitely do that really well. So Jamin, thank you so much for being a guest on Theology Raw. Again, the book is Pastoral Confessions, The Healing Path to Faithful Ministry. Here's let me hold that up here. Is that right there? Yeah, there we go.
You got
it. I got a couple different cameras here going, so yeah, I gotta figure out what I'm looking at. So thanks again, Jamie, for being a guest.
Oh, of course.